I'm Kathleen Inglesby, and on behalf of the Floyd Story Center at the Old Church Gallery, I want to welcome you all here today. We have quite a program to share with you, and we've shared some of it already. It's the result of over 10 years' work with Radford University and Floyd County High School. Please take a look at the Roots with Wings information around the room. We have paired 4 generations to achieve these interviews. High school students, college mentors, community volunteers, and an elder generation. I hope that you enjoy the film screenings and can glimpse a little bit of how valuable these intergenerational connections can really be. When I first came to Floyd in 1980, what impressed me the most were the stories. My neighbor, born in 1904, held stories that spanned generations. The stories created a picture of a different time and place, and for me, they colored vividly a sense of place. It's the stories that have sparked the oral history program at the Old Church Gallery since 1999, when Dr. Wagner first approached us as a potential community partner. Since then, we've collected hours of recordings, transcripts, video, and primary source material, some of which has been made into films. And here they are. A Dream Realized. 10 years of World War II era interviews at Floyd County High School packaged into a DVD set. We began in 2007 at the high school. We started from scratch. We had borrowed equipment. We learned as we went. And by 2015, when we conducted our final World War II interviews, we had progressed to a 150-page project manual, trained over 200 high school students, and this, for instance, is just the instructions for the audio recorder. There was lots more. And we had amassed a collection of interview binders holding all the elements of each interview. So here we have Maurice Slusher's binder. And in the binder is his audio recording on a CD, his DVD of his 2 movies. By 2015, we had progressed to 2 movies instead of 1, or none. Some of the pictures, the primary source material that he brought, his content logs, because we created the keywords from the interviews, and the students in 5-minute tracks typed out everything, the whole hour, hour and a half interview. So this is gold. So it's fully transcribed and it's organized with the goal of making it available to the public. The Floyd Story Center archives are held at the Old Church Gallery, and we're currently in the process of creating an online catalog of the entire oral history collection. We have lots of volunteers. And for the past 3 years, we have, after the World War II, we've moved on to focus on the theme of community and neighborhood, and that's yielded additional treasures. So the Floyd Story Center DVD set represents but a small part of the archives. It represents many years, many lives, and many hearts and hands. I want to thank all our volunteers, Radford University, Floyd County High School, and our Archives Project grantors, Virginia Humanities. We have a representative here today. Would you stand? Thank you. The Community Foundation of the New River Valley. Do we have a representative here from there? The Foundation for Roanoke Valley. This is for the archives project. The Feisty Floyd Philanthropists. We think we have one representative here today. And Floyd Friends of the Library. Do we have representatives of Floyd Friends of the Library here today? We could not have done it without you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So now I have the pleasure of introducing our project partner and featured speaker, Dr. Melinda Wagner.
There's a list of World War II movies that says that there are 4,893 movies about World War II. With these 39 added, that's 4,932 movies about World War II. I'd like to talk a little bit about how the movies were made. And they are made, you know, as Kathleen mentioned, by the project called Roots with Wings, with a subtitle of Floyd County Place-Based Education Oral History Project. That project is an outreach of the Floyd Story Center at the Old Church Gallery, and the partners are, of course, Floyd County High School and Radford University. So the reason it's called Roots with Wings, the roots part is connections, making relationships, making connections among people in the community. And the wings part is the technology that the students learn. Students learn how to conduct interviews, record using audio and video equipment, transcribe, verbatim, hour and a half interviews, archive, find themes in the transcripts, and make movies like the ones that you're watching. We do have, as Kathleen mentioned, a 160-page project manual for the students to use, and that includes instructions on ethics and on how to do each of the skills that I just mentioned. We have a mentor's manual for the Radford University mentors. And if you want to see what they have to do, I put a copy of their syllabus on the back table. So you can see their, 16-page syllabus that they have. So as Kathleen mentioned, 5 age groups do come together in the Roots with Wings team. The Floyd County High School students, the Radford University students, mentors, some of whom are here today, Floyd County High School teacher, Floyd Story Center community volunteers, and me, and resident elders. And that mix of ages prompted one student to say at the end of the semester, I learned that people of all ages can really work together to create a really cool project. There was some surprise, I think, in that. One of the motivations for doing this project is that research shows that resilience is a major factor in leading a satisfying life. Resilience, you know, that ability to bounce back, that ability to figure out a way out or a way through, to adapt, to improvise, to innovate. So a way to foster resilience is for students to hear about experiences of the elders in their own community. In other words, if you plant firm roots in the soil where you're from, then you have a better chance of surviving, growing, flourishing, wherever you may find yourself. So when you watch the movies today, think about what the students learned about coping, resilience, survival. Now, this is from the front porch to the front lines. So along with their war experiences, the elders told us about growing up in Floyd County. You've seen some of those movies here to begin with. They told us about their childhoods, their fights with their siblings, how they met their sweethearts, how they got married. So, you will hear about the front porch in the movies, and the transcriptions include the front porch. But in the rest of this talk, I want to concentrate on the to the front lines part. I want to concentrate on the war experiences and just to tell you some of the vignettes found in the transcripts. And as Kathleen said, those transcripts are going to be, and everything is going to be eventually accessible to the public. When America entered World War II, after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the oldest of the veterans we interviewed was 28. The youngest was 11. Several went to war right after high school graduation. At least one was drafted when he was a junior in high school. Robert Bugg said he was 18 after basic training. And they told us, according to Roosevelt, you're not supposed to ship overseas until you're 19 years old. If any of you fellas is under 19 years old, you can write to a lawyer, or you can see the president, or whatever you want to do. You might as well make up your mind and go, which is what Robert Bugg did. William Hayden was 17 when he was on a tanker that transported fuel for airplanes. The first ship he was on came out of New York, and he helped steer that ship. Some of our youngest interviewees were in their early 20s when they served post-war. So as you hear about the interviews and watch the student-made movies, think about what the students were hearing about what these men and women were doing when they were the same age as the high school and college students who are listening to them. Dangers. Whenever the veterans told of dangers and discomforts, the students learned coping. They learned resilience. They learned survival. Lois Slusher told of her husband, Ed Slusher, who was military police, standing at his guard post for 10 days in January 1943. Where he was in Casablanca in French Morocco. MP stood guard there for 10 days, 24 hours a day, with no idea who they were guarding. That was the Casablanca Conference, where United States President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill met to plan the Allied European strategy for the upcoming phase of World War II. That was January 14 to 24, 1943. Now, for the generals to carry out those strategies, they needed trained soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen. So the dangers and discomforts the veterans told us about began with training. Roger Short said time in training wasn't easy. 20-mile hikes with a field pack and rifle. Some of them didn't make it, and they had a truck come along and pick them up. But I was used to it. I worked on the farm, and I didn't mind it. By the way, Roger Short's father had to handle the family farm by himself after all 5 of his sons were drafted. More than one of the fellows told us that they thought they handled the physical part of training better than their urban buddies because they were used to the hard work on the farm. But the mental and emotional aspects were a different story. It started early for Bernard Cox. When he was inducted into the Army at age 18, he was sent to Fort Meade, Maryland, and Fort McClellan, Alabama. Well, a little old young thing like me, it scared me to death. 13 years old, somebody squalling at you. This old sergeant knowed we were scared to death. They'd holler at you, squall at you. Well, I finally got used to that. And there were punishments. Clarence Goad and Sammy Phillips said if you did anything out of the ordinary, you would have to pull extra guard duty or mess duty, washing pots and pans, cleaning up the mess hall. It didn't take long to find out that you had to walk the line, they said. McCrae Short got into trouble only once. It had to do with cigarette sales. And he had to dig a pit 6 feet by 6 feet. And it took him all night to dig it. Then he had to fill it back in. On the other hand, the Floyd County boys sometimes got by with not following orders. Sometimes they used their common sense instead of following orders and got by with it. That started early for Marvin Nolan. He was in the Navy and he had to learn to swim. As a test, We were supposed to put our whites on, had to go up in a tower, I guess about 30 feet or more, and jump down into 14 feet of water. I thought I'd just balk on that. We never jumped that thing. They talked their superior officer into letting them get their white uniforms wet, hang them in the dry house as if they had been in the water. Once they were trained, the men were shipped to the battlefields. They were seasick on the trip overseas to their posts. Arlie Thompson said New Jersey to France took 14 days. He was seasick, 13 days. In Europe, Arlie Thompson said he was a company runner, crawled and run across France, Germany, and Austria, delivering messages between platoons. All 6 boys in Arlie Thompson's family were in the service. And of course, the strict military discipline continued after training. Arlie Thompson said General Patton was like, you're going to cross that river in the morning at 5 o'clock if you had to make bridges out of your dog tags. And Bernard Cox said the Germans were as scared of Patton as we was. They were homesick. Letters from home were important. They were a way of coping. Al Kelly said letters from home, it was what they were doing back here, and their crops growing good, and the neighborhood gossip, and on things about the horses and the cattle and my cats and animals. But William Hayden said you could get mail from home that you might get a stack postmarked 6 months to a year ago. And Lucille Nolan said that Edward Nolan did not receive half of the mail she sent him. And letters to home were censored. Charles Robert Smith said they would arrive with so much blacked out that you could hardly read them. But they were connections to home. Coping. Resilience. Survival. Things were changing back home. Women's work changed. Virgie Quisenberry shared that while her husband, Harless, known as Red, was in Germany building bridges, back home they had to use ration stamps to purchase gas and sugar. Lois Lusher worked at the Radford Arsenal, and Lucille Nolan worked at the shirt factory. Back in that day, the women always wore dresses to work. And to go to the shirt factory, there was a pickup truck that would pick up all the girls and take them, bring them home. But one day that pickup truck ran into a big snowdrift, and the women had to walk home about 4 miles. So they stopped at Tom Ig's store and bought pairs of overalls, each one of them, to wear over their dresses. So, that started a trend that has continued. Floyd County soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen participated in the major battles of World War II. In June 1944 and on into August, Allied troops landed on a 50-mile stretch of beach on the coast of France at Normandy. Code names for the beaches included Omaha in Utah. 156,000 Allied forces landed there. The invasion was one of the largest amphibious assaults in history. Charles Robert Smith and Willard Delaney were on Utah Beach. From what we were told in the interviews, Charles Robert Smith was one of the biggest to not exactly follow orders, always. He said, well, when we landed on Utah, on a landing craft, we had my armored car and 4 Jeeps, and we had a second lieutenant rode out with me on my armored car, and this lieutenant wouldn't let us pull up out of the water. He said, water's too deep. Wait until the tide goes out, then we'll drive in. Well, the Russian outfit went on. They drove out, and we sat there for 2 hours. I said, I can drive out through that water. He said, you might can, but you won't. And I said, yes, I will. Told that lieutenant, stay on here and take care of this boat. We're going on. And I started my motor, and I went across there, and the Jeeps followed me. And the lieutenant come out with me, too. Coping, resilience, survival. In Europe, it was cold. McCrae Short said to warm up food, they put their canteens on a truck motor. And Harold Spence said guard duty in the North Atlantic was walking around a supply hub, 12 hours on, 12 hours off. It was one cold place. In them days, we didn't have insulated coats. The fact that insulated clothes were missing was corroborated by Bernard Cox. He was near the Rhine River, and he said, one time we was wet, went in snow all day, just had on ordinary shoes and thin socks. That's all enlisted people had. The officers had insulated this and insulated that, and they had good warm clothes. But us little devils didn't have too good of stuff to wear. It wasn't warm. Our feet was wet when nighttime come. We had to dig a foxhole to sleep in, just big enough for 2 people. Bernard and his buddy in the foxhole figured out a way to use each other's bodies to keep their wet feet from getting frostbit. If we hadn't, we'd have been frostbitten. We'd have had bad feet. But we got by. That worked for me and him. That's what we done. Coping, resilience, survival. Another time, Charles Robert Smith used his common sense. He was driving an armored car in Belgium, and they came upon a minefield that the Germans had planted. Now, the Germans could drive through. They knew where the mines were. And there were these small American planes that could fly real close to the ground, and they would tell the soldiers on the ground what to do, where to go and where not to go. So the pilot shouted out, "Do not go through, turn around, go back." Well, it was level on both sides of the road there. And we were in this armored car with wheels high enough that I could just stick my head out and look straight down at the ground. And I said, I can go through there. So I went on through and just twisted around easy, and I went on through it. That pilot landed his plane, and he come down and jumped on me. He said, "You shouldn't have done that." I said, "I told you not to. Why did you do it?" And I said, "Right here, they planted them mines in the field on both sides of the road where it's level. And they want us to get out of the road and get in the field. And that's when we would have got blowed up." So the pilot said, "Well, it looks like to me you're smarter than I am. I believe you're right." Coping, resilience, survival. That's Europe, but the war also raged in the Pacific Ocean. Lawrence Wood became an airplane mechanic in Panama and kept meticulous records of everything an airplane had to have done to keep it in operation, to keep it flying. Now, generally crews worked on planes together, but there were some circumstances about some new planes that meant that Lawrence Wood was left working on his plane by himself. So the line officer asked me when the plane would be ready, and he did not like my answer of 2 or 3 days. "It had better be ready tomorrow," the officer said. So I said, "Well, do you know what you can do with that plane if you think I'm going to have it ready tomorrow?" And he asked me, and I told him. The line officer wanted to have me court-martialed, but the engineering officer came to my rescue. Then, later, I had a talk with the line officer a time or 2 over a beer, and we got things straightened out. Sammy Phillips was on amphibious vehicles that transported troops from their ships onto islands in the Pacific. The first action he saw was September 15 to November 25, 1944, the Battle of Peleliu. Peleliu is a small island in the Pacific Ocean south of the Philippines. U.S. Marines and soldiers were sent to capture an airstrip there. Of about 28,000 Marines and infantry troops, a full 40% died or were wounded. During the war, Ralph Yopp basically lived under the right-hand barrel of the No. 4 turret, that's a 16-inch gun mount, on the USS Maryland. His crew stayed there so much they even cooked and ate their meals there. From that vantage point, Ralph Yop experienced the Battle of Leyte Gulf in the Philippines from October 23 to 26, 1944. And that's generally considered to be the largest naval battle in the war, and by some criteria, the largest naval battle in history. This is the battle when the Japanese first used organized kamikaze attacks. The USS Maryland was hit by those attacks. When Mr. Yop came to do his interview, he brought a piece of one of those Japanese planes with him. Ralph Yop told about a seaplane that the USS Maryland carried, and that plane had lost one of the pontoons on one of its wings that kept its wings balanced. So to get the seaplane back on board the Maryland with the crane, the radio man got out on the wing to weigh it down. And so we brought it in with no problem. But it's just that you have to do things where and when you have to do it. And that was one of them. Coping. Resilience. Survival. Arthur Connor told about serving in Burma in the Southeast Asia Theater, another area of the world affected by this world war. The Burma Road was a supply route from Burma to southwestern China. It's 717 miles through rough mountain country. When Mr. Connor left for war, cars were still pretty rare, and he had hardly driven. He certainly did not have a driver's license. At the end of his training, they said, anybody that wanted to get their driver's license, you go down to the motor pool, and they'll teach you how to drive in 3 days and give you a driver's license. And so I said, oh yes, that's for me, I want to go. First day, it was, this is the steering wheel, this is the brake, and this is the horn, and whatever. And then the next day, they went through a little more about it. And the third and last day, they said, you pull that truck down there and back it up, and here's your driver's license. Then he went overseas. Everyone that has a driver's license, come on over here. That truck down there is yours. It was a big 10-wheeler with 18 drums of gas on the truck. You take that truck and go down to the ammunition depot, and they're going to hook a trailer behind it. So they put a trailer behind that big 10-wheeler, and there I went over the Burma Road. And I think when I went through one little village, I took part of it with me. Lowell Booth rode an elephant to string telephone lines across a swamp in India, stringing the lines on palm trees. Now in Europe, the cold was a threatening force, but in the Pacific, the tropical heat and humidity were a problem. Orland Phillips and many of the other guys in the tropics got athlete's foot, and the medics treated them, no avail. So using common sense again, Orland decided to go barefoot, which of course was way against protocol. Cured himself of athlete's foot, and all the other fellas then did that too. Sammy Phillips had some trouble in the tropics. He almost got into trouble when he was in charge of food storage and inventory. There happened to be 110 pound bags of sugar, and so remember, this is the tropics, and something began to smell, and it kind of smelled like alcohol. And Sammy was accused and suspected of having a side business. But it, eventually became clear what was going on in the heat, and Sammy was in the clear. Some of our veterans were at the front and in the battles made famous by their ferocity. Robert Bugg was at the Battle of the Bulge. After D-Day in Normandy, France, June 6, 1944, the Allied officers, including Americans, predicted a quick end to the war. But for more than a month, as 1944 turned into 1945, came the last major Nazi offensive in the war. That's the Battle of the Bulge, so called because of the bulge the Nazi forces made in the Allied lines. Early on the misty winter morning of December 16, 1944, more than 200,000 German troops and nearly 1,000 tanks tried to drive to the coast and split the Allied armies. The German troops struck in the Ardennes forest in Belgium, a 70-mile stretch of dense woods, few roads. British Prime Minister Sir Winston Churchill praised the American troops. This is undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war and will be regarded as an ever-famous American victory. Bernard Marshall played a part in the battle, building a bridge over the Meuse River, which the German army had wanted to capture. Bernard Cox was in the Battle of the Bulge. He was injured, hauling shells and mortars, and he received the Purple Heart Medal in the year 2000. Back to the Pacific. Iwo Jima is an island south of Japan, about 570 miles from the Japanese coast. The American military wanted to use Iwo Jima as an air base, but Iwo Jima was defended by about 23,000 Japanese Army and Navy troops, and the Japanese were dug into an elaborate network of caves and tunnels that were difficult to find. Preparation for the battle there included 6,800 tons of bombs and 22,000 shells, some of which Robert Nestor delivered from his ship, the USS Wrangell. Then the American Marines attacked. From the deck of his ship, Robert Nestor could see the Marines carrying flamethrowers up the mountainsides on Iwo Jima. Robert Nestor witnessed Marines raising the American flag on Mount Suribachi on Iwo Jima. You know, that scene that's so famous in photos and statues. May 8, 1945 was VE Day, Victory in Europe. Arlie Thompson recalled the reception American soldiers got when they would liberate a German town. The people who had been incarcerated would shake your hand, they would kiss your hand, they would bow to you, they were so glad to see you. But the war wasn't over. Japan fought on in the Pacific. Troy Smith saw Hiroshima after the atomic bomb had been dropped on August 6, 1945. Mr. Smith was on the Japanese island of Okinawa when the Japanese surrender was being signed on the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd, 1945. The dangers of military life didn't end with the end of the war. Clarence Goad was injured post-war during field maneuvers training, and he spent over a year in hospitals. At the announcement of the war's end, whooping and hollering and shooting their rifles in the air that our fellows told us about, George Sheeler was stationed near Nuremberg after the war, where Nuremberg trials were held. In 1945 and 1946, German officials were tried for war crimes. Japan was occupied by Allied troops from 1945 to 1952. Sonny Bernardine signed on as a USO dancer to entertain those troops. Now that's after, during the war, she was a welder in one of the munitions factories and caught her hair on fire. So she decided to do something else for the war effort. What did you get at the end of the war? Harold Spence said you got $15.20 to come home on. From Fort Eustis near Newport News, by bus and train to Norfolk, to Richmond, to Roanoke, and by bus to Floyd and Willis he came. Troy Smith described having to adjust to civilian life after 2.5 years of being told what to do and where to go. At first he would go out and almost forget he now had to pay his own way. You weren't used to paying for anything, and when you'd go anywhere, why, sometimes you'd almost forget to pay for your stuff. And when they came home to Floyd County, some described a feeling of relief, a sense that the future was beginning to look brighter. Times were looking up at the end of the war, Morris Lusher said. Once back home, they used the skills they had learned: coping, resilience, survival, and practical skills too. Marvin Knoll had never driven a car before going into the Navy, and ended up steering a ship headed to China. That's going to instill confidence. Catherine Pauley said that her father, Posey G. Vaughn, learned a lot about electricity and wired the family homes when he came back. McCrae Short learned about equipment and explosives, and that helped him to start his own excavating business. Orland Phillips worked as a machinist during the war. He and his crew used trucks under tarps as machine sheds. After the war, he went on the road locally with portable equipment. And then as interstate highway construction began, he worked on bridges. For Lowell Booth, military life gave him opportunities to travel and exposed him to other cultures. Military life, he said, made him more organized as a teacher. Arthur Connors said, you learn how to get along with different people. You learn how to get along. There were all kinds of people, country folks and city folks, some of them educated, some of them not so educated, and all together you learn how to get along. Coping, resilience, survival. A theme throughout the interviews about World War II was the horrors of war. Obviously, this war, to stop the Nazi regime, was a just and necessary war. But none of our veterans glorified war. They all spoke of the horrors of war. Robert Nestor said, people should know war is hell, and he was glad to speak to young people about it. Another theme throughout all the interviews with our veterans was humility. All of the people we heard from spoke of their time and their deeds with humility. We saw a huge number of medals, which we had to beg for them to bring to show us. Arlie Thompson summed up the pluses and minuses, the pros and cons. I didn't want to go in the service, but you couldn't buy the experience that I had then. I wouldn't take nothing for that experience, but I wouldn't give a penny for any more. Thank you. So those are just some excerpts from these golden transcripts that Kathleen mentioned. I'll get you wired.